Danse, hello. My name is Christian B. Eagle. I'm part Cree, Assiniboine, Ojibwe, and Sioux, but I identify as Cree. Indigenous people have lived in North America, Turtle Island, since the Ice Age. The Cree Nation has the largest landmass of any indigenous people in the world. There are over 1,000 indigenous nations in North America. There are 574 recognized indigenous nations in the United States. There are other indigenous nations, but they are not recognized by the American government. There are 634 First Nation communities across Canada. Canada has three indigenous people, the First Nations, which I'm a part of, the Inuit, and the Métis. Indigenous people have their own names for North America. The most used name is Turtle Island. It's the English translation of the original Mohawk. We Indigenous people are a sovereign people. We are not Canadians. Indigenous people are treated as second-class citizens in both Canada and the United States. We are racially profiled by Canadians. We're seen by many white Canadians as thieves and drug addicts. There is much anger at Canada from Indigenous people since last year. There has been mass graves discovered at residential schools across Canada. Residential schools were run by both the various Christian denominations and the Canadian government. The goal of the residential schools was to forcibly assimilate Indigenous children. Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their families, and they were beaten by priests and nuns at residential schools for speaking their own language. Indigenous children were forcibly converted to Christianity at residential schools. $150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend residential schools for 160 years, the last of which closed in 1996. Many children were physically and verbally abused by priests and nuns at residential schools. Thousands of Indigenous children died at residential schools across Canada. There are still Indigenous men and women alive whose children never came back from residential schools. I am the son, nephew, and grandson of residential school survivors. I knew of the mass graves at residential schools over a decade ago when my Cookham grandmother told me about them. The residential schools damaged every Indigenous family and community. A number of residential school survivors became alcoholics. Some residential school survivors also became abusers themselves when they became adults. Indigenous gangs, which began in the 1980s, were a byproduct of residential schools. The first Indigenous gang members, their parents didn't know how to take care of them due to their experiences at residential schools. Due to the horrors experienced at residential schools, Christianity has been on a steady decline amongst Indigenous people. Last year, over 40 Christian churches were burnt down across Canada after the discovery of mass graves at several residential schools. There was also, last year, protests that included Indigenous people toppling the statues, like that of Queen Victoria in front of the Manitoba legislature in the city of Winnipeg. Many young Indigenous people are rejecting Christianity and becoming traditionalists. A traditionalist is an Indigenous person who follows the traditional ways of their nation, like spirituality and laws. Traditionalists also learn and speak their own people's language. Some Indigenous nations, like mine, have their own alphabet. My people's alphabet is called syllabics. Syllabics were created by a Cree man named Calling Badger. Syllabics have been adopted by several Indigenous nations, like the Inuit, and also adapted to fit their own languages. Going back to indigenous spirituality, indigenous people have different religions. Despite that, indigenous people have never fought holy wars against each other. Even if indigenous nations were at war, if a war party was going to attack a camp but saw the people there engaging in a ceremony, the war party wouldn't attack. They would let them finish the ceremony and then attack. There was respect for each other's religious beliefs. One thing many traditionalists do is they do not consume alcohol or drugs. The consumption of alcohol and drugs is forbidden amongst our beliefs. Indigenous people have more than one god. The Inuit have Sedna. The Mishka, for example, have Quetzalcoatl, and on the Great Plains there is the White Buffalo Maiden, who is a female messiah responsible for the creation of the culture on the Great Plains. Other grievances indigenous people have with Canada is poverty, MMIW, which stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, the high rates of imprisonment of Indigenous people, and the ongoing paramilitary surveillance operations Canada is conducting against Indigenous nations. Indigenous people, many live on reserves, which are essentially open-air prisons Canada created for Indigenous people so the land could be given or sold to European settlers. Only 0.2% of Canada's landmass is Indigenous land. Third world living conditions exist on reserves. Many Indigenous people also do not have access to things like safe, clean drinking water. What is currently happening to Indigenous women in Canada is genocide. There are Indigenous women across Canada who have gone missing or have been murdered. The perpetrators behind many of these murders and disappearances have been white Canadian men. In the province of Saskatchewan, 75% of the male prison population is Indigenous. 50% of women in Canada's federal prison system are Indigenous. Indigenous people serve more time in prison than white Canadians convicted of the same crime. Since the late 1960s, Indigenous nations have been fighting for their rights and their lands. Indigenous protests, occupations, and blockades have become multinational events. What I mean by that is Indigenous people from different Indigenous nations take part. Canada and the U.S. have responded to Indigenous activism with force. The Oka crisis of 1990 began when the Canadian town of Oka wanted to extend their municipal golf course onto a burial ground that belonged to Ganasatake, a Mohawk community. For 78 days, Mohawk warriors faced the police and eventually 4,500 Canadian soldiers. The Oka crisis of 1990 remains the largest deployment of military forces against Indigenous people in the history of North America. Indigenous protests continue to this day. I will finish this lecture with why the word redskin is offensive to Indigenous people. A redskin is an indigenous scalp. It was a word created by European Christians. It was the British who introduced scalping to North America. The British and later the Americans put bounties on redskins. If you cannot understand why Indigenous people are offended by the word redskin, imagine someone calling you after the body parts the enemies of your people cut off your ancestors. Anyways, that's all. Ekwishe.